Hyvää huomenta kaikille ja tervetuloa tähän sessioon, jossa meillä on aiheena vastuullinen matkailu ja erityisesti miten sen pitäisi näkyä tai mitä se tarkoittaa koulutuksen ja tutkimus-, kehitys- ja innovaatiotyön näkökulmasta. Welcome everybody and especially welcome our international visitor and lecturer, Professor Harold Goodwin. On the screen you see some of his background, but he will introduce himself more detailed. And this presentation will be about 45 minutes or so, and we hope that you can and you make questions during the presentation already, and of course after that you have a chance to make additional questions and we can discuss. We have time, about 2 hours time, so we have plenty of time. And those people online, ne jotka ovat siellä verkossa mukana, niin pääsette seuraamaan ilman kirjautumista, mutta jos haluatte tehdä kysymyksiä, niin sitten täytyy kirjautua sisällä.
Thank you very much for that. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to stop every 7, 8, 9 slides for questions so that it can be interactive. I was asked to say something about myself. I was trained originally as a political scientist, did a broad social science degree. I don't have a single qualification in tourism, so I'm not quite sure how I ended up as a professor, but there we go. For the last 20 years, I've been campaigning for responsible tourism and working with predominantly master's students on research and professional development around the world. I'm now retired, emeritus professor at Manchester Metropolitan University, so I don't teach any undergraduates anymore, but I still do a fair amount of teaching abroad for specialist and professional audiences, I guess, like this one. But the main part of what I do now really is advisory services of one sort or another, either working on over-tourism, perhaps say something more about that shortly, but also with World Travel Market. We run a very big in-service educational program alongside those trade shows in London, Cape Town, Sao Paulo and in Dubai. So I'm still very actively involved and still travelling probably more than I should. But let's get started. I was asked to look at this question of responsible tourism and what it means for hospitality education and R&D. And it may be a surprise to you, but I haven't actually talked about this before, so it's going to be interesting to see how it goes. The first thing I wanted to say is that we've known about the problem of our sustainability on this planet for a long time. We've known about greenhouse gases since the late 19th century. We've been aware, really, I suppose, since the 1968 and Apollo 8 and that photograph that everybody remembers of Spaceship Earth. We've been aware of the problems coming our way. And since 1972, we've had every 10 years a major international conference on sustainable development. But the truth is that in that 40 years, we haven't really made progress. We've found a few solutions to a few problems, but the problems of our sustainability are as big now as they were 40 years ago. We're losing the race to deal with the challenge of sustainability. 40 years ago, The Limits to Growth, which was a Club of Rome publication, came out. It made the front page of the Sunday Times magazine. And I remember reading it, thinking that cannot possibly be true. There's no way we as human beings would allow that to happen. That is so frightening and so disturbing that we'll not permit it to occur. Over-tourism is the example of how we have allowed it to occur in relation to tourism. The over-tourism we have is because the industry and governments have paid lip service to sustainability but done nothing about it for the last 40 years. And this is the consequence of that. I've given you the online reference. This publication has not had the amount of attention it ought to have done. It comes from the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. And what Graham Turner did was to look at the forecast made in 1972 and look at what had happened since. And frighteningly, most of our development in the last 40 years has precisely tracked the forecasts which were made in 1972 and which I laughed about in 1972, believing that they would never happen. They've happened. Business as usual has taken us right down those pathways. And that, in a way, is where my anger about this idea of sustainability comes from. I think it was Einstein who said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and again, thinking it's going to change something. And it doesn't. And in a way, what we've done with sustainability is a form of insanity. We've gone on mouthing sustainability, but doing nothing about it. So, the problem is that sustainability is a very abstract concept. It's very, very hard to define it, and it's complex. So, for example, somebody like Richard Branson can talk about creating biofuels by growing seaweed in the oceans. This ignores the fact that our oceans are already seriously polluted, that we have declining fish stocks, increasing amounts of plastic, and that growing seaweed in the oceans will further deplete the amount of oxygen in the water. To solve his problem of being able to fly his planes, but actually to make the situation in the oceans worse. And that's the fundamental problem. We have competing and conflicting objectives. So people will find a solution to one problem, but not recognise that actually that's going to make another aspect of sustainability more difficult. People tend, and academics, you asked me to make this relevant to academics, academics are very, very vulnerable to this, because an academic career requires you to become more and more knowledgeable about a narrower and narrower field of knowledge. So I was invited to represent tourism at one of the preparatory conferences for Rio Plus 20. They put tourism and oceans together. So I'm the tourism person, so I'm clearly going to speak last. I sit all day listening to eminent oceanographers from all around the world talking about the problem that they're working on in ocean science, how that's going to save the world. I was the first person to raise the question of plastic pollution in the oceans. None of those oceanographers raised it at all, because it wasn't what their research was about, so it didn't matter. It's a real problem about the way academics approach these kinds of issues. Aristotle, quite a long time ago, before I was born, pointed out that one of the really big problems is phronesis, which is the practical knowledge which enables you to avoid unintended consequences of your actions. And we're really poor as a species, and we're very, very poor as academics at looking for the unintended consequences of the solutions that we come up with. We need to get much better at that. Aristotle knew about the problem, but we still fail to teach our students how to think in a broader, more interdisciplinary way about the issues and how they can be solved. I won't bore you with this. You must all be aware of climate change. It's a big issue in tourism, partly because so much of the transport that we use to get to the place where we're going to be a tourist is carbon intensive in its use. And it's not just planes, cars, trains. When I worked in Leeds, I was on an intercity train back to London. I was on the last train of the day. If there were more than 3 people on that train, I'd be surprised, which means that that was probably a more carbon-intensive experience for my journey to London than any flight I've ever flown on, because the number of passengers on that train was so small. It isn't just a problem about flying. It's a problem about the numbers of people and the nature of the technology which is used. This is Hotelier magazine, run by the International Tourism Partnership, which is essentially a group of all the leading hotels in the world. And they're saying that the hotel's climate change commitment means a 90% reduction in carbon. The industry is nowhere near achieving that objective. Travel is a polluting industry. We get greenhouse gas emissions, we get litter and trampling, we get the use of the public realm. And the hotels in London, for example, benefit massively from the fact that people can wander around London getting their selfies in Trafalgar Square and make no contribution to cleaning up the mess they cause or the damage they cause by clambering all over the lions in Trafalgar Square. You get the induced effects of people wanting to migrate to areas where they've had a holiday and second homes. Tourism is a major polluting industry. It is not a clean industry at all. And the other problem is that tourism free rides. And I'm going to stop in a minute to take questions. Lord Marshall, in 1994, when he launched the Tourism Tomorrow Awards, when he was chair of British Airways, said that the tourism and travel industry is essentially the renting out for short-term lets of other people's environments. So the hotel I stayed at last night here was charging a rent for me to stay in this very beautiful city, but they make no contribution to the maintenance of this city, other than paying their taxes in the normal way that any other business does. But all businesses pay taxes. Most businesses don't make use of the public realm for people to enjoy and be motivated to come to the place for that reason. So tourists essentially freeload off the social and physical structures which have been created by the communities who live here. But let me stop there and take questions for a minute. Are there any questions? Is that because people aren't understanding what I'm saying, or because I'm talking sense, or because it's not interesting? Is there anybody online who's not able to follow? Yeah, but you're not getting anybody saying they can't hear or they can't follow? Everything is fine. Okay.
I think we are just warming up, so please.
Well, okay, let me see if I can heat you up then. If you're just beginning to warm up, let's try and get you hot. So, what's happened with over-tourism is that it's the first example, and it's why it's so important, I think, as a social consequence. The fig leaf of sustainability has fallen off. So a lot of destinations around the world now who are saying, we are bumping up against the limit to growth. We are bumping up against those planetary constraints. Can anybody else be squeezed into Venice? Yeah? So in a way, what's happening now is that over-tourism has shot from being something which was largely ignored in terms of its sustainability to something which is very much in the front line because people are seeing the consequence of bumping up against these planetary limits to growth. And of course, you know, what we need to remember, and Cricketer Holidays is a good company, don't get me wrong, I'm not in any way criticising Cricketer Holidays. They were just honest enough to admit it. But every tour operator will tell you this, when a place gets spoiled, we stop selling it. We move on. We can't sell it. If it's spoiled, we can't sell it. So these are the planetary constraints. And the problem with sustainability is that if you take the UNWTO declaration, they talk about optimal use, respecting socio-cultural authenticity. They talk about fairly distributed benefits. But those are not precise. You couldn't use those. You wouldn't let a master's student do a master's thesis using these criteria to assess whether something was sustainable, would you? Because there's no way that these tell you whether something's sustainable. It's all a matter of opinion, which is why the UNWTO are right when they say that this needs strong political leadership. Can't be done any other way. Local communities have to define what is authentic. Local communities have to define what's a fair distribution of benefit from tourism. But these are political questions, not technical questions. This is not a technical definition, which means it's useless for an academic. Then we have the Sustainable Development Goals, designed by a committee, so everything you could imagine is in there somewhere. 19 goals, 130 odd targets. Nobody can do that. We've just piled everything in, hoping that it might make a difference. So the real problem is that sustainability is too abstract and too general to have any utility. The other truth is that people don't engage with abstract issues. They engage with abstract opportunities like love, but they don't engage with abstract issues. For people to engage, the issue has to be something they feel, something they experience, something that's a problem to them. So what happens with responsible tourism is instead of coming up with a long list of issues, you focus on the things which matter locally. What is it that matters in Mikkeli or Jyväskylä or London? What are the issues that matter there? There are only two global issues which tourism causes. One is obviously carbon emissions, but all human activity causes carbon emissions. The other is plastic, because the plastic gets washed into the oceans from the rivers, and the oceans accumulate these gyros of plastic. But in every other form of pollution caused by tourism, the impacts are local and need to be dealt with locally. So, for example, my sister lives in North Wales, where water's a problem. There's too much of it. There's no point in North Wales in hotels investing in water-saving technology. Absolutely no point. There's every point in them finding ways of employing more people, because unemployment's a problem in North Wales. I live in Kent, which gets the same rainfall as Israel. The hotels in Kent do need to be encouraged to invest in water-saving technology because we're water-stressed. We're short of it. North Wales has too much. The issues are different in those two places, and we're only 300 miles apart. These are differences within nation states. They're not between nation states only. So what we need to do is to change the language that we use to get people to engage in dealing with the issue. And that's what brings us to the principle of responsibility. Now, they are not in any way the same thing. Sustainable is the abstract long-term goal, whereas responsible tourism is about taking responsibility for achieving sustainable development, dealing with those issues which are things which matter to local people and their environment. It's the difference between an abstract aim and what you do to achieve your aim, your objective. And of course, as academics, we know that difference between aims and objectives when we set research questions, you know. The aim may well be abstract. The objects are much more specific, and responsibility deals with those objects. This is my new way of trying to do this, because people do struggle to see what the difference is. Sustainable is a feel-good word. Responsible is a feel-bad word. If I say you, sir, are responsible for far too much carbon emissions, you stop feeling good, don't you? That's not nice. If I say, oh, you're wonderful, you're sustainable, you feel good. So responsible is a feel-bad word. The other thing about responsible is that we know precisely what it means. And the reason for that is every human being who's alive on this planet today argued with their parents about what is and is not responsible behaviour. You probably had the most intense arguments for the longest period of time with your parents about the meaning of the word responsible. Everybody can remember that. And of course, everybody who has children then has a refresher course when they bring up their own children. So the knowledge of what responsible means is widespread and deeply known by human beings. And it becomes very precise. What are you taking responsibility for? What have you done about it? And what have you achieved by what you've done about it? Immediately you're into that. If you say, I'm going to make this sustainable, it's vague. And you can't really be challenged. It's vague, it's aspirational, and to be honest, it's largely inoperative. People use that word, but they don't mean it, and they don't use it. So with responsible tourism, the emphasis is on what you do, the action, and the transparency about sharing the knowledge about what you've done with others. So politically, if you're discussing this with a politician, this phrase becomes very powerful. It's about using tourism rather than being used by it. You start talking to politicians with that kind of language, they understand immediately what you mean by that. So the aspiration of responsible tourism is to use tourism rather than to be used by it. And I would argue that most places are still used by tourism rather than use tourism for the benefit of local people and their environment. This reference here, you hear this a lot in Southeast Asia. Tourism is like a fire. You can use it to cook your food, or it can burn your house down. Your choice. If you don't control it, it's a very real risk that it will burn your house down. So why we focused on the word responsibility, and I can explain if anybody's interested exactly how we got to this position, but it was from practical engagement with real people. The reason that responsibility has worked and has got traction, I think, is that it is about how you respond, what you do to deal with a particular problem. It implies and indeed requires action, and I think that's critical to achieving change. You have first to agree there's a problem. When you agree there's a problem, you can look for a solution. This comment here was made actually by the CEO of Shearing's Holidays to one of my groups of students at a conference in London. And he made, it's a very obvious point, but we forget it. Responsibility is free. You can take as much of it as you can handle. You don't have to buy it in the supermarket. You can just take it. Now, that doesn't mean that actually taking responsibility is without cost, because it requires you to do things. There's nothing stopping you taking responsibility for any negative impact that you see around you. The opposite, of course, of responsible is irresponsible. And most of us don't want to be called irresponsible. This is a Facebook page. It's the banner off a Facebook page that I maintain called Irresponsible Tourism. It's a great place for seeing what people are blowing the whistle on at different times about irresponsible tourism behaviour. So it's a critical difference. Sustainability is merely an aspiration. It's vague. It's incapable of any operational definition, and most of the time people just use the word not intending to do anything about it. Responsibility, by contrast, is the actions you take to achieve the aspiration. It's recognising that you have a duty and that you can be held to account for what you do. So I think that's a good place to stop for questions again. Is that difference clear between responsible and sustainable? Is there anybody online wanting to ask a question? How embarrassing. I don't want to hear any more of that.
Then there is Anu Mood of Finland saying that think global, act local. I would say there are global issues like saving energy and water, using alternative energy, reducing emissions.
Can I respond to that one? Yep. I agree with the act local, think global. But in truth, water is not an issue everywhere. You know, and me saving water in North Wales, where there's a serious risk of flooding, won't do anything to improve the water supply in sub-Saharan Africa. This is just nonsense. What matters is that you deal with the issues which have an impact where you are. And the only global issues are, as I've said before, carbon, which is largely about the energy agenda, and plastics. Everything else is only a local issue. It may occur in lots of different places in the world, but it doesn't apply everywhere. Plastic and carbon emissions do.
Anu is also adding that, and then we have local goals, always respecting local people and communities.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Well, she's going on with the previous comment about, and then we have local goals, always respecting local people and communities.
We'll come back onto that issue of local communities shortly. Is there anything in the room anybody wants to raise? I'm using this image a lot. It's a First World War recruitment poster for soldiers for the First World War. But I think people do need to think about what they're going to say to their children about what they did to try and avoid global warming. a lot of us are ostriches. It's unfair, actually, to compare us with ostriches, because ostriches have a very good reason to stick their head in the sand. We don't. And the other problem is the frog. The problem is that the difficulties get worse slowly every year. We get used to it, or we kid ourselves that the changes in the weather are just a natural consequence of the variance in the weather, which is President Trump's view. But the science now, I think, is overwhelming. It's very clear that we have been heating up our planet since the end of the 19th century. There's been a 30% increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere since 1958. So 6 years after I was born, until now, the amount of carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas in our atmosphere, has gone up by 30%. And it's very difficult to get carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere. Difficult, not impossible, but difficult and expensive. And the longer we leave dealing with climate change, the more expensive it will become. So this is the original slide which was used at the conference in 2002 to make the case for changing the language to responsible. We've only been doing it for 25 years, 29 years. UNWTO Global Code of Ethics existed, principle of sustainability, triple bottom line. All we did was to suggest that you might do something about it, that you might take some responsibility for achieving sustainability. And we made the point that you can't outsource that responsibility to other people. It's your responsibility to deal with your polluting effects. You want to ask a question?
Yeah, Eeva Koivula from Xamk and from Kohti vastuullista matkailua. I'll introduce myself because there are people who won't see me. One question about this picture. What about education box here?
I would argue that education has an important role in all these areas. So the people who are going to manage our protected areas and national parks need to have education about this. The local community, we need to do that through schools. The tourists, we need to do, again, through schools, and the operators are doing more and more to raise awareness. In terms of the hotels and the accommodation, that's where education fits in. We need to be training the hoteliers of the future. Now, I can tell you, because I talked to them, that the senior people in a lot of the hotels, this has never been said about Finland, so don't take this personally, but they will tell me that what's coming out of the hotel schools is now not fit for purpose. That the people who are graduating don't have the knowledge about sustainability and various other issues as well, but sustainability is the one that always comes up first. And now they're doing their own training within the companies because they've given up on the universities. 40 years on, and I'm not saying you aren't, but most universities are still not providing the level of sophisticated knowledge about the environmental management of hotels that they need.
Yeah, that's what we are after. That's why I asked that maybe we could at least in our own development add the box of our, I mean by education, I mean this vocational education, higher education, the institutions, the curricula and so on.
Yeah, but the reality is that most hospitality schools around the world are doing no research in this area, which is shocking when you think about it. The chief engineers, I'm trying to get a chief engineer to speak at one of the World Travel Market platforms. I can't, because all the chief engineers from the hotel chain I want are meeting together to discuss the latest developments in the technologies that they're using. In Australia, there's actually a professional association of chief engineers of hotels. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist anywhere else, as far as I know, but in Australia it does, and they meet every year in an annual conference to hear research papers, most of which they've written themselves, about the latest technologies and what works. That's what we need to see, and really universities ought to have taken the lead on that, but they didn't. They stood back and they've left the space. Very sad. I'm sure you haven't stood back in Finland, but they have generally elsewhere. The problem is, when you say it's everybody's responsibility, it very rapidly becomes nobody's. And that's what's happened over the last 40 years. And that's what we need to change. So, this is the Cape Town Declaration. And I thought what I'd do, because this is boring for me, is first of all about minimising negative impacts. So the most obvious example of that in relation to hospitality is reducing carbon emissions and water consumption in hotels and managing waste better. All of those are ways of minimising the negative impacts. Generating greater economic benefits is about spending money in the local supply chain and employing local people rather than importing the labour from away. Now, I'm sure you don't import labour in Finland, but in many countries labour is imported in to the area and put up in hotel-owned accommodation rather than train local people. That's a mistake in my view. We'll talk more about that shortly. It's about involving local people in decision-making so that they have some say over how the industry works. It's about putting back into nature and conservation by making contributions to the conservation of cultural heritage and of the natural environment where you live. And then the really important thing, it has to be enjoyable. If it's going to be part of tourism, it's got to be an enjoyable experience. And it's got to be a meaningful connection. So last night, I'm taken out for dinner to a local restaurant called Hovey, where the waitress, without being asked, tells us where all the ingredients have come from, in terms of the local farms and the areas where that food's come from. That enhances the guest experience and demonstrates that they're thinking about where they're purchasing their products from. That's local sourcing, and she's turning the local sourcing into a meaningful experience for me as the guest. Providing access for people who are physically challenged and socially disadvantaged. Finland's quite good at that on the physically disadvantaged. I don't know about the socially disadvantaged agenda. Most important of all, I think, for responsible tourism, because everything else flows from this, is travelling with respect. Being culturally sensitive and respectful of the culture in which you're travelling. That's a good place to stop, actually. Am I not being controversial enough? Oh, right, okay. Yeah. Shall I carry on in the hope that some more come in? I've still got a lot of... Okay, put your hand up the next time a question comes in. So, I'm showing you these not because they're of any particular relevance, except that it is important to remember that the world out there, beyond tourism, is also changing. This is Tesco's, a supermarket chain in the UK. This is Sainsbury, another one. This is Lidl. Now, it's not as though other industries aren't doing rather better at talking about their sustainability than travel and tourism. And I would say that one of the really big problems about travel and tourism, and I'd include hospitality in this, is that it self-references way too much. That it doesn't look at what's happening slightly beyond its own boundaries. So people used to say, they don't anymore say it to me, but people used to say there's no evidence that consumer demand is changing. And that's because all they've ever done is look at the tourism surveys. If you look at the surveys which are done into consumer preferences more broadly in source markets, you find massive change. But because we self-reference and look only at the tourism surveys, and because those questions are often not asked in the tourism surveys, we think nothing's changing. And that's just foolish. A lot's changing around us. Consumers move on. This is one of the new slides. I've used this before, so it's a bit risky, this one. In the past, if I think back to my parents, there's a lot of fuss in the past about whether the hotel you booked had actually even been built, or whether it was as close to the beach as it said it was. That used to be a really big issue. If I think back to my childhood, the issues that were coming up in the consumer programs then were about that. And then there was a question about whether you'd actually even get clean sheets on your hotel, in your hotel, whether the sheets would be clean. Those aren't issues anymore. And then came the issues of health and safety and the imposition of standards from Europe in particular on hotels in the developing world, where the barriers for example, around the balconies needed to be of a greater height. And often I can see where that's happened. You can see where they've had to raise the height of the barrier when you look at the hotel. Security, quality. Those things are no longer really issues. They're not the things which are in the mainstream. The hotel or the resort's no longer enough. When I first started doing research on tourism, when I was at the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology in 1994, we had students looking at brochures to wildlife destinations. So a brochure of hotels in Zimbabwe, for example, would predominantly display the bar with no people in it, because the myth was when you got there, the bar would just be entirely for you, so you wouldn't have any people in it. And big hotel swimming pools, again, with no people in them. Now that would look incredible now. There's no way that a hotel brochure now would be full of photographs of bars and swimming pools. That's not the way it is anymore. Partly because we now want to see people enjoying themselves, and partly because we want to see people outside of the hotels. The hotel and the resort is no longer enough. People want to be outside with that community that they've gone to visit, having a shared experience with the community. It's moved on completely. The other great truth is that more and more people have some understanding of ecology or environmental management because they've studied it maybe at school, very possibly at university. Those people can spot an aerated shower. They know when there's too much water coming through the shower. They don't need to be told that by the operator. They simply know because they know what an aerated shower is. They know about water shortages and they know about carbon emissions. They're not stupid. And of course, that next generation of consumers is much more environmentally savvy than many of the people who are teaching them. And it's hard work keeping your syllabuses up to date and your curricula up to date. But the consumers have moved on. There's also a broader consumer trend towards experience. The experience economy, a couple of books now come out of Harvard Business School, so it must be true. Money and time are the currency of experience, and people value the original, the genuine, the sincere, and the authentic. Interestingly, for example, this looks like a very authentic experience of Scandinavia to me. Yeah, this is a Nordic experience. By the way people are dressed and the way the rooms are laid out. You wouldn't see this in England. This is the phrase that they use to sum it up. This is Gilmore and Pine. Authenticity, they say, is a new strain of consumer desire. And of course, it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As you go through all those needs, once you've got food, a good place to live, a clean place to live, the next thing becomes the quality of the experience. And I see there's a question.
Yes. Anu Nylund from Mood of Finland is first stating that the challenge is to make companies to promote what they actually are already doing. We are working this out by coaching the companies and encourage them to tell what they do. And then she continues, what's Harold's opinion about the sustainable or responsible labels? Sustainable Finland is to come.
I'm going to come to that.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I want to leave it because I've got some slides later on, but I'm coming back to that issue. What I would say is well done for doing the coaching. What needs to happen is that we see a Finnish hotel or tour operator win an award for their sustainability. And there are plenty of businesses in Finland which could do that. One of the things that happened in Jyväskylä yesterday was an agreement between Visit Finland and the ICRT Finland that they would run a workshop once this year's awards are announced, when they open, run a workshop for Finnish businesses who may want to apply for an award. I find it quite annoying, if I'm honest, that there's so much good practice in Finland which has not been recognised in the awards over the years, but that is because people have not applied. So I think it's time. The person is absolutely correct. It's time. And they do need encouraging to do it because often you don't realise how good what you're doing is until you sit down and write the award application and actually remind yourself of all the things that you're doing. So with experiential tourism, we're moving from people just wanting a cheap holiday to people wanting an experience. More and more people are under pressure to take shorter holidays, so they want more intense experiences when they take those holidays. And that's a consequence of the experience economy plus declining living standards in most European countries. What people are after, though, is a memory. They want a quality, deep memory to take home from their holiday. And that can only be created jointly with somebody from the local community. So the saddest thing is when you see the interviews on the Ramblas in Barcelona with tourists saying, I haven't seen anybody who lives in Barcelona. I've only seen other tourists. That's a real downer for people because they come to that foreign country hoping to find that contact with someone from a different culture. If they only meet drunken Australians or drunken Brits, it's not the same, even as meeting a drunken Catalan, although you'd be unlikely to meet a drunken Catalan. So they're looking for quality and deep memories, and that's what you want, because those quality, deep memories are what create the viral marketing, those recommendations which make your business run. It's a phrase from one of my students, actually, Justin Francis, who set up responsibletravel.com. He says you should be able to taste the difference in the responsible tourism holiday. It should be a better experience. His business is currently growing at 60% a year, which for a travel business out of the UK is an extraordinary achievement. So what's the hospitality agenda? Another new slide, risk. I think it goes like this. There's a series of costs and risks, which are energy, water and waste. Yeah? The classic kind of, the core in a way of environmental sustainability are those three things. Then there's the good neighbours question. Are you employing local people? Are you giving local people good prospects? Are you sourcing your food as locally as you can? Are you contributing to the local economy? That's improving the guest experience as well. Are you putting back into conservation of culture and the environment? Are you contributing to festivals and the maintenance of cultural heritage? Are you doing your bit to maintain the environment which attracts people to stay in your hotel? Are you doing socially beneficial things? There's a hotel chain called Apex, which is particularly interesting with two things. One, its hotels are all former office blocks which have become redundant, which they've re-engineered as hotels, but they also offer free meeting space to local community groups with it living within the immediate area. They have really good relationships with their neighbourhood as a result of doing that. So there are things that can be done. Then there are the direct business benefits, the richer experiences in and beyond the property, which comes from celebrating the local component of what you're offering. That brings you repeats and, critically, for hotels, extended length of stay. It's the fact that people realise there's a lot more they could have done, which makes them come back again and spend longer. Too few hotels talk about what you can do around the hotel. They forget that nobody, I can say this I think with total certainty, nobody travels all the way to Mykolaiv to stay in a hotel. You don't have a hotel that is itself a destination. There are maybe a dozen of those in the world. You don't have one of them. So the only reason somebody's going to sell a hotel in Mykolaiv is because people want to come to Mykolaiv. And yet you look at the hotels and they tell you nothing about the wonderful architecture and the other good reasons to come to Mykolaiv. Mistake. Yeah? They should be encouraging people to stay longer. The other dimension is this sense of being guilt-free. We know from consumer marketing in general that people don't recommend things which they think might be slightly dodgy. So if they're not happy about the environmental criteria, they won't risk their reputation by recommending you. You think about who you're prepared to recommend. It's one of the things you think about. Am I taking a risk if I recommend that hotel? Will my friend come back and say, how could you recommend a hotel that has air conditioning or which puts the temperature of the room down to 15 degrees when you leave it. Lots of hotels still do that. Why would you take that risk if you're recommending to a friend?
I have a comment here about the awards. Anu is responding that Finnish Travel Gala has the category of responsible...
Sorry, can you...
Sorry. So Anu is responding that Finnish Travel Gala has the category of responsible actor or action established by a small AFTA, but more could be done, so ICRT and Visit Finland new awarding is great.
Good. I'm pleased to hear it. Now, this is from my trip last week. I was in India. I told you I travelled too much. This hotel, which is a Shangri-La property, has finally put this up in every bathroom. And they're explaining why the water that comes into your WC, your water closet, is slightly brown. The reason is that they are recycling the water which has come through the showers and from the kitchens. They're recycling it, bringing it back to flush the toilets in the hotel with. So they've got a dual water use system. That saves an enormous amount of water. The other hotel that I was put up in treats its own sewage, so it has its own sewage treatment plant within the hotel, and the water from that sewage treatment plant then is used to water the grounds. Again, saving very large amounts of water from the public supply. And those, do you remember those awful A cards that people put up? I've got one. I couldn't find the photograph this morning outside. I've used it, but I've got one of a non-aerated shower with the A card from the same hotel room saying, "Please recycle. Please put your towels back on the rack to save water." And the hypocrisy of that. Yeah, they haven't changed the shower heads, but they want me to put my towels back on the rack to save the water. That's the kind of thing which tourists will increasingly begin to recognise and call it out for what it is, which is gross hypocrisy. This is far more sensible. It's a nice piece of print. You can join many of our other guests in protecting the environment by using your bed linen more than once. Place this card on your bed if you would like us to change the sheets. So last night, something very similar to that was in my room. But the bed is laid out for a couple. So there's about 1,000 different pillows on the bed. What the smarter hotels are doing now is laying out the double bed for single occupancy with just 2 pillows. And all the spare pillows and bedding is in an ottoman, a linen box at the bottom of the bed. So none of that needs to be changed unless it's been got out of the box and put on the bed. That reduces the consumption of water in the hotel dramatically. Very cheap to do. Guests are not offended by that. It's dead simple, very effective, cuts your costs. But very few hotels are doing that yet. It's a very simple way of reducing the amount of bed linen. I feel very strongly about this. I doubt whether people would come to Finland to indulge in paedophilia, but people do travel, particularly to the developing world, to find children to abuse. More hotels ought to be doing this, making sure that you report suspicious behaviour, because otherwise children will go on being sexually exploited. So what can we say about the academy? You asked me to do this, so don't take it personally. There's a number of problems about the academy. The first is that you're not encouraged to be interdisciplinary. Academic reward comes for knowing more and more about less and less. And actually, sustainability requires precisely the opposite. You need to be able to look at something in an interdisciplinary way in order to look at its sustainability. So we've trained our academics not to think or work in an interdisciplinary way. We're 40 years on from that 1972 conference at the UN, and in the research excellence framework that the UK government still use, there is no category for work on sustainability. Shall I say that again? There is no category for academic work on sustainability in the Research Excellence Framework operated by the British government to assess research in British universities. Now that's very, very bad. Unfortunately, it's not only a problem in Britain. It's a problem with nearly every academic assessment exercise, is that interdisciplinary work is still not valued. Disastrous for our environment. There are very few of us cross the divides between physics and chemistry, let alone the humanities and the social and natural sciences. Now, I happen to have done that, but I would argue at quite high personal cost. It took me a very long time to get the professorship because I didn't have an established track record in any particular discipline. And, to make it worse, no qualification in tourism. But I made it in the end. The high-ranking journals tend to be very specialist. You know, you will say what we think as a journal in your article and support our arguments, or else you're not going to get published. There's a lot of censorship in our journal structure. Still not a unit of assessment in the ref. The peer review process is very conservative and very narrow. It narrows what people can publish on. Industry is much more multi and interdisciplinary than academia. And that's a problem because industry knows that. Industry knows that it needs to, and one of the things that people say to me a lot is the academics are really good at researching public opinion. No, you're not. You can't get the funding to do the scale of surveys. TUI can decide overnight that they will survey their market in all their source markets and get their views about sustainability. And then within 3 weeks, they'll have 1,000 replies from each market. They know way more about what their consumers want than you will ever know. Because by the time you've raised the money, sorted out the questionnaire, sent it to 5 people, brought it back and published it in an academic journal 5 years later, you're 8 years behind the pace. I think you're agreeing with me, aren't you? Academics are rubbish at this. Absolutely rubbish. And it's a shame. I try and persuade TUI to publish their data, and they do publish some of it. But obviously for them, it's commercially really valuable. The academics who ought to be making this freely available, when they are able to do it, they publish it in a journal which is locked up so nobody can read it, unless your university happens to subscribe to that particular journal.
Yes, we discussed about this last night and agreed. I think that universities of applied sciences have good chances to combine different fields, like
yes.
we are doing, the environmental engineering and tourism and cultural studies and so forth. So the structure actually is not a problem here. I think the biggest problem is the mindset of thinking about tourism and what we are after. And that's why this presentation and discussion was asked from you. Your slide about the UN agenda and the role of tourism in it. I think there is a big task to change our mindset and the industry as well. Many companies are ready for it. Many organizations are ready for it, but so far we have not managed to get this idea to our curricula. Do you have any good examples of how it has been done in some other parts of the world?
I think you're right that these universities have a better chance of doing it. But if you look at what motivates, let's get a little bit personal about this. What university academics are motivated by one of two things. A very few are motivated by both, but most are actually motivated by one or the other. Some want to teach, and some want to do research. So one of the classic questions anybody at interview will ask their head of department is, how much time will I get for my own research? Now, John Swarbrick, who many of you will know, always says in response to that question, why should you have any time? Because all of your time is paid for by the people you're paid to teach. Now, he's being provocative when he says that, and he does believe in research. But that point is right. Particularly, unless you've got a research grant, you're thieving from the students in order to do your research. So then the question is, how useful is your research to your students? And that's a structural problem, because much of the research that people want to do has no practical utility. And the journals like that. That's the other structural problem, is the journals, because you're only going to get promoted on account of your research if it appears in a peer-reviewed journal 3 stars or above. So there are, I mean, despite the fact you don't have the interdisciplinary problem within the institution, you still have the interdisciplinary problem within the context of publishing, which again still constrains what you're able to do.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the situation here in our University of Applied Sciences. We have lecturers, senior lecturers, and then we have RDI people. And of course, there is a tendency to work more together. So the time of projects and dealing with companies is not away from the students. It's rather something that benefits both the RDI and the education, and that's what we are heading to and try to do more and more in our curricula.
It is interesting though, isn't it? I accept that, and I'm not trying to discourage you from doing it. I am saying it's hard. I think it still is hard. But if you think when these kinds of universities were set up, and the polytechnics in Britain the same, they were set up to work with the local industries to meet their research and employment needs. And unfortunately, the polytechnics and the universities of applied sciences here have moved away from that. And I think that's part of the answer, is to move back into serving the local economy. Not be subservient to the local industry, but create the critical thinkers which will ensure that your local industries, and tourism is one of them, remain highly competitive in a more and more competitive world. And unfortunately, the polytechnics and the universities of applied sciences moved away from that. Yeah, particularly in the UK, because all the polytechnics became universities and they all wanted to be like universities. And the consequence of that is they're no longer meeting the needs. And in the hotels, it's the strongest example I know is it's in the sector I work in. The hotels are no longer relying on university hospitality graduates. They're training their own people because they don't think the quality of what's coming out of the universities is high enough. I think the gentleman might be provoked. No? Okay. So, what are the fatal flaws? The first is phronesis, this inability. I do think the most important skills we can give our undergraduate students and our graduates is the understanding of probability, so that they realise when they see the climate change science, they see what that means for them personally. So they need to understand probability, and they need to understand phronesis. They need to be able to look for unintended consequences of their actions. And that's actually quite a high-level intellectual skill to train, but we've been bad at it for years. We need to get better. We need people to be familiar with the tragedy of the commons, the problem of open access common pool resources. The paper made it into science, but we don't teach enough about the tragedy of the commons. Climate change is a tragedy of the commons problem. You know, I don't want to bear the cost of helping you solve your climate change problem. I want to be able to fly and you change your behaviour. And that's why government is critical to this process. It won't be achieved by consumers alone. The prisoner's dilemma. If I cut my flying, how do I know that you'll cut yours? I might not take that seat on the plane. You may get that seat on the plane cheaper because I didn't take it. I don't know what you'll do. Which is why government, again, becomes critical to the process. It's what governments do that really matters. Short-termism. I mean, you're the Vice-Chancellor of Manchester Metropolitan University only really needs to worry that things will be okay when he retires. The company that runs the sewage, the board of directors that runs the sewage works in my hometown, they don't need to worry about 10 years from now. They'll all be retired and got their fat pensions. They only need to worry about the next 2 or 3 years whilst they're still directors. Our institutional structures are very short term. That's a big problem in dealing with long-term issues. And very poor understanding of risk and probability, as I said earlier. Those are really big, and those are the kinds of intellectual problems that universities ought to address with their students. You know, it's academics who ought to be able to teach this stuff in ways that our students understand. In terms of theory, there's quite a lot of it. Some of you will know Xavier Font. When I wrote my book on responsible tourism, the first edition, I sent the first chapter to Xavier, and he wrote back and said, there aren't many references to tourism in here. And I emailed him back and said, well, that's the problem, Xavier, isn't it? There aren't many references in tourism that deal with these issues. I think there's still only 2 papers in Annals of Tourism Research on the tragedy of the commons. And yet tourism uses the commons arguably more than anything else other than the carbon emissions. And yet it's hardly ever dealt with in the tourism literature. So, you know, we have a problem because in terms of our research agenda and what we publish, too much of it is very narrowly focused. We're not short of theory. Porter. Most of you will have heard of Porter, I suspect, because of cluster theory. Porter's really important because his latest thinking is about this creating shared value. Now, interestingly, this paper, rather uniquely for Harvard Business Review, which normally locks its papers up, this one is freely available on the web. You can get it as a PDF. There's no reason you should read that. What he basically says is that, and this is writing post the 2008 crisis, this is where the rethinking came from. We haven't placed, he would say, enough emphasis on thinking about what we do, how that relates to society. We've taken too seriously Thatcher's argument that there is no such thing as society, there's only individuals and their families. We haven't thought about the implications of what we do as businesses for society. And he argues that what we should do is be creating shared value, creating economic value in a way that also creates value for society. Actually, tourism businesses do this all the time, but they don't talk about it. That restaurant last night, which was sourcing its food locally, is creating shared value with those people in the local economy. And they're making a profit from it because they've got a higher value product because it's locally sourced. So the restaurant itself is making a bigger profit, and they're benefiting not by giving any charity, but by doing business with a local business in their neighbourhood. That's the notion of creating shared value. And tourism could do a lot of this. We do a lot of it anyway, but we don't talk about it. Hospitality could do more, but it already does quite a lot. It's not social responsibility, philanthropy, or sustainability. It's just a different way of doing business that benefits local communities and the neighbours. It's a new way of achieving success. And it's not business acting, it's business acting as a business, not as charitable donors. And that old model of CSR is slowly going out of fashion, that corporate philanthropy. I will tell you this story, but I won't tell you who told me. Yeah. There's a film called Cheap Neutral, which you can find if you look at the links on my website. But I was talking to the managing director of a big African safari company about that film. And he said, no, that's not how you understand it. This is carbon offsetting. He said, if I go out of the office and see a beggar and kick the beggar half to death and walk on and then give $100 to the next beggar I see, that's offsetting, isn't it? I paid for the damage I've done to the first beggar. That's what carbon offsetting is. It's very frightening when you think of it in those terms, that the damage you've done, you've done. You can't get rid of it by absolving yourself of blame by some charitable donation. And what Porter is saying here is, forget about paying a pardon fee by making a corporate donation. Think about changing the way you do your business so that you're doing good by the way you do your business. I think it's a very powerful argument. You expand the total pool of economic and social value. You grow the cake if you operate in this way, and more people benefit. So it's a socially good way of doing business. And the point he makes is that any business needs a successful community around it to thrive. If you don't have that, you have the Jamaica model of tourism, where you have to spend an awful lot of money on security and entertain your guests within the resort, because the guests don't want to go out and meet the local community. You have islands of wealth in a sea of poverty. Contrary to the self-contained entity idea of the firm, the old narrow view of capitalism, you need competitive advantage by defining your business as the things you do with the community as well. Creating value with them enhances your product. That's your competitive advantage. So, shared value is policies and operating practices that enhance the competitiveness of a company while simultaneously advancing the social and economic conditions in the communities in which it operates. It's really easy for hospitality businesses to do. And let's be fair, lots of hospitality industry businesses are already doing this. But they could do it more, and they could talk more about it. This is an example, not a very obvious example to use in South Africa, but because I wasn't asked in advance to talk about this, I didn't have all the slides with me. So this is one from Africa, which I happen to have with me. This is a group which takes over failed lodges set up by the government which have failed, and they are about creating shared value with the local community. And there's the evidence that they've collected. That's the kind of money that they, as a business, let alone what their tourists spend, this is just what the business is spending in the local communities on other businesses, by sourcing their furniture locally, by buying their bed linens and their curtains locally. They're creating all of that value. Now, they could buy it cheaper by importing it from China, but they have a more authentic experience for the guests by doing it this way, and they're able to demonstrate the economic value going to the local community. I particularly like this one. This is women who, for a long time, were just abstracting salt, Bellini sacred salt, for their own use. Now it's being sold internationally in some of the best restaurants, and they're beginning to make a really serious income from it. There used to be only 5 people doing it, now there are 30. And it's been recognised by the slow food movement in Italy as a member of the Presidium. I've been given one of these, so I feel particularly personally connected. This is Pilato, who makes sculptures from waste scrap metal. This is Mandela burning his passbook. And this is Pilato's representation as a modern sculpture. You can see the kinds of money that means going into the local economy. I'm not going to talk much about Chris. He's a former student of mine. He's based in Australia. He's just done his PhD with Suzanne Becken, looking at how to communicate the green message to your guests. It's a whole other lecture, so I'm not going to deal with it here. But that website is seriously worth looking at and watching. What he's found is that the best way to get repeat business and get people to behave more environmentally friendly is to make it part of the welcome when they arrive at his set of cottages. He's got really strong empirical evidence for what a difference that makes. Really useful source of teaching material. And one to watch because he's still rolling this out. Keep It Real. This is Xavier Font's work. You may be familiar with it. He's done it for all 4 British visit offices. Again, really useful material here to use with students about how to communicate the message. And again, this point that he's picked up from Justin as well, it just tastes better. It's just a better experience. There's a lot of material in this, and that again is freely available on the web. Greentourism.com is the only It's not a certification agency. It employs environmental consultants who go out and help you to reduce your environmental impacts and secure market advantage from it. They're very ethical. They offset their own carbon. So that's worth watching. They're about to launch a new website, which I thought was going to be launched in January. It's clearly been delayed a bit, but it's worth watching. It will be dramatic when that comes out, the new face. Now, in terms of research, reliable information about what works and what the implications are for the bottom line, we're really short of that. TUI know precisely what value they get from every pound of investment in reducing water consumption or carbon emissions. But they obviously don't share that. It's commercially very valuable. So in the public domain, there's very little information. But universities of applied sciences be absolutely classic research area for them. Knowledge of what others have done, what works and what doesn't. That's a kind of conference function or research function. Intervention at different levels or spheres of government. Again, well placed to do that. And what do the different stakeholders think about these issues? Again, something which in the local area you could do research on. Resources. Evidence matters. These are the Responsible Tourism Awards. If you want to find case studies, this is a really great place to go and look.
I have a question. Juho Pesonen from University of Eastern Finland is asking that, can you compare beggars with CO2 emissions? You stated earlier that CO2 emissions is a global problem, but beating the beggar is only a problem for the beggar getting beaten.
Is only a problem for the...
Is only problem for the beggar getting beaten.
I don't understand.
Beggar getting beaten. That's what it says
I
here.
don't understand the question.
Juha, can you define your question? Anyone else's questions?
What has he reset?
Nothing yet, but if we wait until Eva has a question.
Okay, while we are waiting for Juho's definition, one comment on the theories, or what was the part of the slide. Back to education. What do you think? There are different theories and different practices in environmental education, and a lot of research on that field. Also research made in universities with students. Are you familiar with this? I mean, thinking about how to help students to understand. This is the main problem. And there are many obstacles, as you showed. Why not to? Could environmental education give something to this problem? What do you think?
I'm going to come down because I can't really hear what people are saying.
Okay.
But I did hear your question. Let me answer it. I know it feels as though it's difficult, but the people doing environmental education have been doing it very well for years. That expertise exists, I'm sure, elsewhere within this university. And this is again the problem of the lack of an interdisciplinary approach. When I went to work at DICE, which is the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology, I said to my new boss, I said, look, I know nothing about conservation or ecology or biology. Almost nothing. And he said, that's not the hard part, is it? The hard part is getting people to understand the issue, communicating the issue, and the politics of it. Now, I knew about the politics because I'm a political scientist. I didn't know about the communication, but they had other people who understood communication. And I think that's part of the problem, that we get so much stuck into our disciplinary cell. And it is almost a cell, you know, with a small number of other people that we talk to, all from within our own discipline, that we forget that there's other people out there who've made massive progress in how to communicate about environmental problems. But we're not familiar with that literature, we don't use those textbooks. So you get students leaving a hospitality course who may know nothing about carbon emissions, may know more than their parent about the problem of carbon emissions, despite the fact that you're sending them off to work in an industry responsible for a great deal of carbon emissions. And the problem is exactly this disciplinary focus. And I think it's particularly difficult in tourism and hospitality, which I would argue, and this makes me unpopular, but it's what I believe, they're not academic disciplines. They're topics of study. They are not in themselves academic disciplines. They've generated no theory of their own. They have generated no research practices which are unique to them. They are entirely using theory and research methods from other disciplines, but then not keeping up with what's happening in those areas. And I think your point from earlier is absolutely right, that the universities of applied sciences are a really big opportunity to share that knowledge across the disciplines in a way that is harder in more traditional universities. But it hasn't really been done.
Okay, now we have a definition from Juho. And first of all, he says that it was related to the earlier example of how you can offset beating the beggar by giving other beggar 100 euros. And then the definition is that tourism causes CO2 emissions, which are global, so solutions offsetting are global. So it is not the same as beating a beggar, local problem. So I do not think that they are comparable.
You're absolutely entitled to think that. I happen to disagree with you. I could go to a beggar in another country and beat him half to death and then come back to my own country and give money to Oxfam. The point holds, I think, that actually you can't offset these things. You have done damage. I've planted over 100 trees now, but I would never claim that I planted those trees to offset the carbon. I planted those trees because it's a good thing to plant trees, not in order to offset the carbon that comes from my aircraft emissions. I have to take the responsibility for those carbon emissions.
Then there is a question from Anu Nylund from Modo, Finland. I think one of the best bases for me was studying the environmental studies in Helsinki University to get the global and general understanding. Well, it was more of a statement.
I agree, very sensible.
And that's all at the moment.
Anybody else? More questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Harold, for your presentation and everybody active in this discussion. I think we have earned a good break now. And at 1 o'clock, we have this other session with a focus on business case, which means that we are more discussing about what will happen, should happen in the business part.
I've just remembered that the person who asked specifically about certification, I said it was coming up later in this lecture. It isn't. It's coming up in the next lecture, which will also be available online, I think. So you'll be able to find it there. I'm sorry about that. I mixed up in my own mind which lecture that material is in.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. You have deserved good lunch. Good.